From the beginning, God's point in having a chosen individual, family, or nation was for the express purpose of sharing their knowledge of God with others. God never intended His Word to be used as a tool for segregation, but as an instrument to produce perfect unity among all people, unity in Him and in His truth. Of course, the fallen nature of man has a tendency to twist anything good into a self-serving means of lifting up some and excluding others. The Jew-Gentile dissension in the early church has always been represented at face value in every message that I can remember. Could it be that this is a unique situation in the Bible that has absolutely no prophetic or forward-looking aspect to it? I can't imagine that would be the case. But when I began to read, God immediately directed my attention to the correlation between the Jew-Gentile dissension of that time with the legalism versus liberalism mentality within the church today. Just as the Jews and Gentiles found themselves at odds with one another then, so legalism and liberalism have infiltrated the church today. And just as then, both factions are wrong. Now, the doctrine's critical, but it cannot be twisted into a law code. It must not be twisted into a law code. This makes many who claim Christianity no different from the Jews to whom Paul was writing. At the same time, if we ignore the truth of Jesus and the instructions of the early church, we are equally condemned by Paul's words. The answer for us is the same as it was for them. In Galatians 5:16 we read, "This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh." Now, it's just as much the lust of the flesh to condemn those in the church who are less spiritual as it is to believe you're free to do as you please. Both sides are wrong in these circumstances. The answer will not be found on either side. No one can walk in such perfect adherence to the doctrine that they can rightfully condemn anyone else. Paul reminded the early church and us of all the past failures of God's people. And then he said in 1 Corinthians 10, 11, and 12, "Now all these things happen unto them for ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed, lest he fall." Now those of the Old Testament thought their views were right, in the same way that the early church felt as though they were justified in their actions, and many feel as if they're acting in good faith today. Paul's answer from his letter to the Galatians continues in chapter 5, verse 18. "But if ye be led of the Spirit, you're not under the law." Now that doesn't mean we can ignore the doctrine, nor does it mean that we're to look down on those whom we consider less spiritual. If we're led by the Spirit, we will do those things that God intends, and we will avoid the things He despises, without looking down on anyone in the process. Legalists press down those whom they feel superior to. Legalists pull down others to a level beneath the will of God. In both cases, the outcome for all is far short of the will of God. But when the Spirit is in control of the life of an individual, He will lead us to the center of God's will. He will cause us to lift up the liberals to walk on the highway of God's will. And He will help us to knock the legalists off their high horses so that they can walk humbly in God's perfect will. When we look at the life of Jesus, isn't this exactly what we see in Him? He lifted up the poor and hurting sinners while undermining the falsely assumed authority of the proud. Now, we can't do this on our own. If we try, we will err to one extreme or the other, and both are despicable to God. Paul continues to point us in the right direction and away from both extremes in Romans 8, 1 through 4. "There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus hath made me free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, and that it was weak through the flesh, God sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit."